Okay, welcome everybody. I would like to tour you through Perl.style, a new documentation guide, style guide that started shipping with Perl this year. Before that, I'd like to talk a bit about the origins of this project, and I'll start with a short personal introduction. I'm Jason McIntosh. I started learning Perl in the 1990s, and I'm still learning it. I've worked as a professional software engineer this whole time, but in 2019, a collision of events encouraged me to refocus my career on writing. One of these events has particular relevance to this project. In his keynote address to that year's Perl conference, Sawyer X gave an honest look to the ways that Perl falls short as an approachable language to newcomers. Among other things, he focused on its documentation, noting its vast amount and how some of it was either outdated or difficult to comprehend. He suggested a future where the documentation instead puts beginners first, values consistency and readability overall, and better lends itself for use as a teaching tool. At the encouragement of my friend Adam Herzog, I took this as a call to become a contributor to Perl's documentation. Months later, under a grant from the Perl Foundation, and under the guidance of Sawyer and many others, I revised the novella-length documentation of Perl's open built-in and completed the Perl Open Toot man page that Tom Christensen had begun years ago. All this work shipped with Perl version 5.3.2 last year. The heralding of Perl 7 at last year's TPC led to a follow-up project that had emerged from my earlier conversations with Sawyer. It would be a research project that would establish new documentation standards for Perl, gathering up both community expertise and best practices from Perl's fellow open source language projects. After receiving another generous grant from TPF, I started this work in the fall of 2020. I didn't quite know where the work would lead, so I just called it the Metadocs Project at first. I began by gathering up documentation about documentation within Perl's core collection. That included PerlPod by Larry Wall and Sean M. Burke, a reference to the pod markup language that Perl docs use, and perldocstyle by Russ Albury, providing documentation formatting guidelines to authors of CPAN modules. And that was about it, but it gave me clues to look elsewhere. Perldocstyle refers to established Unix man page practices, and researching these led me to the man pages man page of the Linux kernel project. From there, I saw how kernel.org treats documentation as its own discrete project and how much care and attention they give it. I was really impressed, and I wanted to see more. So I asked colleagues to name some open source languages with good documentation. Thus, I ended up studying Python, Rust, and yes, Raku. And very quickly, I saw that all four of these projects, Linux kernel included, had two things in common. They treated their documentation as a discrete subproject with its own team, and they all had a style guide of some kind, whether that's a formal man page or just a few wiki pages on GitHub. Perl had neither of these. The specific goals of the Metadocs project suddenly seemed quite clear. One more thing about my background, I have a degree in journalism, and this imbued me with talismanic reverence for the AP style book, a set of guidelines that helps all the contributors of a given publication to write more or less in the same voice, or at least harmoniously. I love Perl, and I wanted very much to gift Perl with something like this. So, Perldocstyle. It ships with Perl as of version 5.3.4, that is just last month. Here it is on perldoc.pl. Some credits first. I was this document's primary author, and I used some of the Perl Foundation's grant funds to hire Samantha Hamilton, a freelance technical writer, to act as an impartial editor. Via GitHub pull request number 18,275, the document's initial draft received tech review by Dan Book, David Cantrell, Nicholas Clark, Felipe Gasper, Graham Knopp, Ken Williamson, and Sawyer X, and was release engineered by James Keenan. The content steals liberally from all the open source projects I mentioned earlier, and it borrows some key concepts from Daniela Procita's diataxis documentation framework as well, which I'll talk more about later. The guide takes a descriptive approach, not a prescriptive one. That is, it documents how the best Perl documentation has been written rather than attempting to dictate some other way of doing things. I did my best to make the guide readable and interesting. Really, I want you all to read it. It's just the first draft of what I hope will be a living document that has a lot of growth and change ahead of it. And notably, it's not super long. In fact, let's start stepping through it. The guide itself keeps to classic Perl pod style, leading with name and description sections. Its very first paragraphs set its scope, Perl's core documentation, which it defines as all the docs that ship with Perl. That means all its 100 or so man pages, as well as the documentation of all the modules that Perl pulls down from CPAN when you install it, as listed in Perl mod lib. And it gives a special shout out to PerlFunk, a self-contained reference work unto itself with hundreds of individual sections. The guide states its above all goal as consistency with an eye to newcomers. There's that Perl 7 sneaking in again. Encouraging consistency of Perl's docs will help its readers, especially those new to Perl, to feel more welcome and engaged with Perl's documentation. And this in turn will help the Perl project itself grow stronger through having a larger, more diverse, and more confident population of knowledgeable users. On to fundamentals, definitions of what the docs are actually made of. Pod. Here's that descriptive tone. Perl documentation is written in pod. If I were greenfielding this, it would be Markdown, but Perl uses pod. And if Python docs can still use restructured text in 2021, Perl can use pod. American English sounds a bit nationalistic. It's mostly just about spelling. In American English, color has no U, math has no S, collective nouns like team take non-plural verbs and so on. It's an arbitrary choice. But the majority of Perl docs already favor American English in this sense. And so we adopt that as its official standard. As the guide says, it's like agreeing on the number of spaces in your code indentation. It doesn't affect the compiler, but it does prevent the human reader from encountering jarring stylistic shifts mid-document. It just makes for a smoother read. The documentation's encoding should be UTF-8 everywhere, and the underlying style guide, which this guide declares itself to inherit from, is the Chicago Manual of Style, aka CMOS. I had seen, I gotta move my window thing here. There we go. I had seen most every other technical style guide I encountered name themselves as extensions to CMOS. So I took a page from them. More to the point, I took about 1,200 pages from them. This is one of the first things I'd like to change, speaking of living documents. I've learned more about how organizations use CMOS since last winter, and know, despite what perldocstyle says right now, nobody should literally read through it. CMOS is a trusted foundation and good to have as an editorial reference, but project contributors don't really need a working knowledge of it. I've learned that many documentation teams base their own work on the Microsoft Style Guide, a Chicago extension that adds lots of guidelines specific to writing about software. And others use the Google Style Guide, which builds on Microsoft's, which builds on Chicago. I think perldocstyle will want to take these into consideration. The final paragraphs of the fundamental section touch on contributing to Perl's docs, which for now is just a pointer to the same Perl hack man page that tells you how to contribute to Perl's codebase in general. The guide's next major section deals with the formatting and structure of Perl documentation. A lot of what's here explicitly builds on Perl pod style. It's really well-established stuff regarding how to title documents, what sections readers expect to see, and so on. Again, layers of tradition applied descriptively. But Perl pod style is about user-contributed docs, and this is about core docs, most of which are distributed with Perl itself, so the concerns are subtly different. For example, the question of license and copyright sections is an interesting one. There was and remains a lot of inconsistency about how the docs treat this information. What's in perldocstyle now is the result of a lot of conversation I had with P5P in 2020, and I expect it to have a lot more refinement ahead of it. The consensus I found was that you don't need license and copyright, at least not for documentation that's maintained as part of Perl's source repository, because anything in there inherits from Perl's own license and copyright info. But the docs certainly can and should have author and contributor sections offering appropriate attribution. After that comes a section on formatting rules. This again gets into some arbitrary seeming stuff informed by my own observations of Perl's source management tools, what the current docs do, conversations with the community, and occasionally looking at other languages' best practices. Just like the choice of American English, our aim here is consistency. And it's not necessarily very engaging material on its own. It's a lot of sections about the length of the lines and pod source, how deep to indent. Example code blocks, it's 4, by the way, because that's what the Perl style man page says. When to include parentheses after mentioning function names and how to represent placeholder arguments and so on. Honestly, a lot of this just adapts the notes I made as I revised the open function documentation last spring. I don't consider it exhaustive, but I do feel it's a good start towards documenting the best ways to format Perl's own documentation. I'd like to highlight a couple of my favorite guidelines because they represent wholly new ideas to me. First, did you know that Pod supports comments? You can create both one-line comments and whole comment blocks using its for and begin end syntax, addressing them to a fictional formatter named comment. Any pod renderer will discard this text and it stays visible to people directly reading the doc's source. This takes advantage of the docs as code philosophy that Perl's already pursued since time immemorial. The pod really is source code that compiles into different published human readable formats, and I loved to learn about a new way to take advantage of this. Related to that is tables and diagrams. Perl documentation tends not to have much of either because Pod doesn't really support them. But you can fake it with those begin end blocks that Pod processors and HTML processors in particular can choose to work with. The new style guide points this out. I'm not sure if this will go anywhere, but I did want to start to open the door for Perl documentation to have more illustration and to do so in a careful and accessible way. Finally, the guide covers the special formatting rules that PerlFunc uses, which are a universe unto themselves and which we really don't need to get into here. But I honestly had a great time puzzling them out to the degree that I did, and they were a lot of fun to document. On to tone and style. My guiding light through this section was the diataxis system devised by Daniela Procida, which identifies 4 main kinds of technical documentation, what perldocstyle calls documentation modes. In this section, I map these onto how Perl has historically divided up its own docs and came up with tutorials, cookbooks, reference, and explainers. So the guide presents a little subsection about each. Tutorials have a focus on learning by doing. Of the 4 modes, they need to show the most deference to newcomers. Some tutorials will likely be the first documentation read by a new Perl programmer, and maybe even a new programmer entirely. After completing a tutorial, the reader should feel like they've been led from zero knowledge of its topic to having an invigorating spark of basic understanding, excited to learn more and experiment further. Perl Intro is the most prominent example. The core docs have plenty more specific tutorials such as Perl XSTut, Perl PacTut, and Perl RETut. Cookbooks focus on results. The reader has specific problems to solve or a task to complete, so let's get them sorted. A cookbook doesn't spend a lot of energy explaining how any of this works. That's for other manual pages to cover. And this is where Pod's excellent support for cross-references comes in handy. Use those L tags. In the larger world, this is where resources like Stack Overflow fall. In Perl's docs, we find cookbooks in sections 4 and above of the Perl FAQ and in man pages like Perl Unicook. Reference sections are all about description. Austere, uniform, and succinct reference pages, often arranged into a whole section of mutually similar subpages, lend themselves well to random access by a reader who knows precisely what knowledge they need, requiring only the minimum amount of information before returning to the task at hand. PerlFunc is the star of this show in Perl's core docs, of course. It also tends to be the default mode of any CPAN module's documentation. If you have only a little bit of space, a single pod section dangling off the end of your .pm library, it should probably be a reference. And the 4th and final mode is explainers, deep and expert dives into some topic. PerlFunc to one side, most of Perl's built-in documentation falls into this category. A great example is PerlSyn. SYN, which both defines and philosophically defends Perl's famously idiosyncratic syntax and uses all the words it needs in the process. The rest of the Perl doc style chapter comprises several micro essays, each based on me spending a year studying documentation, seeing how it compares to other languages docs, and learning about the craft of technical writing in general. I'd really like you to read these and let me know what you think. In this presentation, I'll pull out just a couple of points I've already heard the most feedback about. Assume readers' intelligence, but not their knowledge. By this, I mean that documentation should treat the reader as smart, curious, and ready to learn, but they should not assume that the reader has been a system administrator since the Usenet days. Avoid unexplained discussion of technologies other than Perl. That includes C and Unix, and make sure to use jargon with care, using summaries or cross-references as often as necessary so as not to alienate new readers. Also, don't assume that your readers know who Darth Vader is. While Perl's documentation distinguishes itself with a distinct style and voice, it reaches the most people when it aims for cultural neutrality. One other, lead with common cases and best practices. This is also inspired by the reformatting of the open built-in under Sawyer's guidance. Yes, there's more than one way to do it. But sometimes, over the span of decades, some ways seem to start to seem a little better than others. Let's describe those ways first, and in the most detail. If you're writing an exhaustive reference and there are alternate ways to accomplish something the reader should know about, perhaps they're working with legacy code, cover them afterwards and feel no qualms about marking them as deprecated or at least unusual. The open functions documentation now spends almost all of its energy on the 3-argument style and relegates all of the classical forms with bare words and such to a trailing section called legacy usage. It's all still there. It's just not given equal measure anymore, quite deliberately. The document concludes with an index of preferred terms. Honestly, I find this the most fun part of any style guide, and it's really just a miniature domain-specific glossary advising consistent spelling and usage of terms that might otherwise invite ambiguity. This index is very short. It's really just the terms I happen to know during my research. It's likely to grow quite a bit. A couple of examples. Unix. Perl's core docs spell it in so many creative ways, but a slim majority, as well as the internet at large, seems to favor capital U, lowercase everything else, and no asterisks. So that's how perldocstyle has it. Closer to home and arguably a little more interesting, the guide details when to capitalize Perl and when to follow it with a number. And that's the new style guide in a nutshell. What happens next with it? Well, again, I'd love for you to read it and tell me what you think. You can contact me by email or drop by the docs channel of irc.perl.org. And as with the rest of Perl, pull requests, always welcome. The first docs team project based on the style guide's vision is a documentation audit and gap analysis now underway by Hawar Latif Khan, a communication specialist that the Perl Foundation has hired through a grant from Google's Season of Docs program. And yes, by the way, there is a docs team officially recognized by the Perl Steering Council, though it's really just me right now. And so far, its role and initial activity has been the auditing project. In his address to the Write the Docs conference in April 2021, Daniela Procida shared an emblem that he found stamped on his grandparents' treasured bookcase after he had inherited it. It says, "Always complete, but never finished." This struck him as an apt epigram to the art of technical writing. Of course, it strikes me as a fundamentally Perlish expression too. Perl's documentation has always boasted accuracy and completeness, and we will never call it finished. Let's adopt the same motto as we work to make Perl's core docs the best that they can be. Thank you very much.
We just have a few minutes for questions if anybody has anything.
I had a quick question, Todd. This is Brett. Thank you for the presentation. I'm interested in documentation just in general, but my question for you is, in your research, have you run into, I guess you're doing audits, you're probably looking at, the topics and information that's covered. Have you run into any gaps, or do you anticipate looking for any gaps regarding either the capability of Pod itself or tools that are currently available?
That's a really good question. What I'm focusing what we're focusing on right now in the auditing project is content. What people looking to learn how to use Perl C, which is not the pod. Your question is legitimate and separate from that, and I'm very interested in that as well. Because yeah, pod does have shortcomings, a couple of which I touched on. It's very old. It predates Markdown and other things in that philosophy by many years. So it doesn't have inline image support or a way to make tables and other things that are actually quite useful when writing technical documentation. So yeah, these are legit questions and they're ones I look forward to digging into. And if you have any thoughts in the meantime, I would love to hear them post talk. I think that'd be great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Like I said, feel free to drop by the docs channel on IRC right now. I don't know if that'll be the permanent home of documentation discussion. The other notable channel is pound docs-audit on the TPF Slack if you happen to already be in the TPF Slack, and that's where we're discussing the docs audit ongoing right now. And if you're interested in helping out with that effort, drop me a note. Per my lightning talk with Makoto yesterday, we could use another volunteer or two. All right, well, I don't see any other or hear any other questions, so I'm going to bow out. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of TPC this year and see ya online.